coming to what was the first recorded case of Japanese bathing and coverage of Japanese bathing, it actually wasn't covered by the Japanese themselves because they were, shall we say, a bit slow to cover their own history. Instead, we can look at China's coverage of Japan. Because in 297, in the history of the Wei Kingdom, they described their encounter with the, at the time, Japanese, or the Middle Kingdom, as it was called at the time. Now, the Middle Kingdom, as the Chinese described them, were a peace-loving folk who had a somewhat well-ordered society. Now, what they also noted were three things in particular. They had an interesting preference for female rulers. They had a taste for strong alcohol. And lastly, they had strong habits of personal hygiene. One thing of particular importance that the Chinese noted was that the Japanese were very heavily emphasizing purification, especially using water to cleanse as well. And they noted some particular cases such as when a person died, the entire family of the deceased would bathe together to ritually cleanse themselves of the dirt affiliated with death. Because in Shintoism, there is this duality between cleanliness and filth, or purity and defilement. One very fascinating early example of this was that people would actually, if they were to go on a dangerous sea voyage, or there was a crisis in the country, they would choose one person, and this one person was not allowed to bathe at all. And the reasoning was that they were going to contract all of the disease and all of the misfortune that might come the way of the group. And only if they got through the disaster or through the voyage and nobody else had gotten sick or had been hit by a misfortune would that person be given the reward of being allowed to bathe again and live on. However, if they failed and anything happened to the rest of the group, that person would be eliminated. It's just a crazy example, and I think it's fascinating. I think that's a really fascinating practice to think that if you don't allow them to bathe, they will become like I was about to say a mushroom, but that's not the word, but a sponge that will just suck up all the misfortune and the disease. But yeah, old times were interesting. They were indeed. This brings us to Japan's first coverage of their own history, which was in the form of the Nihon Shoki as well as the Kojiki. Now, these were highly mystical, or shall we say, fantastical in nature. So they aren't believed to be super historically accurate until the later parts of the books. Even so, we can still decipher some things if we look at the origin stories of some of the gods. Because the gods in the Shinto belief were very strongly connected to purification rites, and they would often bathe. And even Izanagi, the sort of all-creator god, one of the originals, from his bath, after he had bathed, three gods appeared, or sort of were born from that bath, being the sun god, the moon god, as well as the god of agriculture, I believe, and fertility. Yeah, so the Shinto gods were also very strongly connected to water and purification, and this is a theme that just keeps popping up, where water and purification are just super important to the Japanese. And returning to that idea within Shinto of purity and defilement, I actually made an earlier video about Japan's largest minority, the Burakumin, which you can check out right here, because that minority is very strongly connected to this dualistic idea of purity and defilement. Fascinating video, and if you want to check it out, there you go. But moving on to technology now, because there were two types of baths in early Japan. And I do call them baths, but they actually aren't what we would think of as baths today, because you didn't submerge yourself in hot water. No, these were both based on steam, and they were known as iwaburo and kamaburo. Iwaburo means mountain bath, or rather, rock bath. And these were often found sort of naturally, so along the inland sea or along rivers, if you found a mountain with a cave, that might be an iwaburo, or people even made caves, so they would empty out a rock and then they would use that as an iwaburo. And these were extremely popular even up until the Edo period, as well as the kamaburo, where you would create, through rock and clay, you would make this almost looking like an oven or a kiln, where you would go inside and again trap steam. Now, the difference between the two, other than the construction, or lack thereof, you might say, was that the iwaburo, or the rock bath, was you heated it up through hours of warming wood, and then you could, like a sauna almost, dump seawater on it and that would create the steam, which was the bath. The kamaburo, the oven bath, however, was interesting in that they would burn leaves and fresh twigs or green twigs in order to use the vapor or the steam released from those watery plants to make the steam bath, because they believe that this had health effects. One very interesting fact about especially the kamaburo or the oven bath was that in 672, the emperor at the time, called Tenmu, was wounded when he was shot in the back with an arrow. And in order to recuperate, he used one of these oven baths. And he did this around Kyoto, and so that area came to be called Yase, because ya is arrow and se is back. So just a little fun fact there. And now we move on to the very large importance of Buddhism, as well as the transition towards bathhouses. But before we get to that, I just want to, what shall we say, honor the books that have helped me make this video, because I've used two books in particular for the entirety of this video. These books were Clark Scott's 1994 Japan, A View from the Bath. It's a rather academic book, and so it is very packed, and it's a fascinating read, along with Peter Grilli's 1992 book with The Pleasures of the Japanese Bath, which is a much more accessible and, what shall we say, reader-friendly book in the sense that it outlines a lot of Japan's history as well and culture surrounding baths, but does it in a really cool way where they use pictures all the time of Japanese onsen and bathhouses and etc. It's really cool, and I would recommend you read both books or any one of them if you're interested in learning more. So I will, of course, link them down below. Now, of course, the books are fairly old, so do keep that in mind as you read them, but very awesome books. And now, on to Buddhism. So as Buddhism entered Japan, in the larger temples especially, there were as many as 7 different buildings, and one of these were the bath building. Now, this is where the Buddha statues would be purified or cleansed, or abluted, I think the word is. As well as the monks, they would also clean themselves there. Now, over time, eventually, the commoners were allowed to come into the temples and wash themselves there. And this became such a popular phenomenon that they actually didn't have enough space. And so they started to create these bath buildings separately as well, so that the commoners could go there and bathe. However, how do you pay for such an expensive thing? The interesting thing there was that the rich and the powerful and the rulers would often pay large amounts of money to the temples so that the commoners could have these baths and could use them freely. Now, why would they do that? Because it showed that you were pious and that you were committed to the Buddhist faith and ideals. And so it basically was like a big spiritual rub or rub on the shoulder. That's not what you call it. Basically, they wanted to look good in the eyes of God and to get good karma and all this. So in order to do that, you would pay money and you would support these bathhouses. And that was how many of them were built, and continued to support the commoners in bathing freely. So Emperor Shomu was one of the emperors primarily responsible for promulgating Buddhism in Japan. And he was the one responsible for building Todaiji Temple in Nara, where Japan's largest Buddha statue is placed. Now, along with that building, they built the Nikatsudo, which was a secondary building where they drew water used for washing the statue, as well as the monks belonging to the temple. They would also wash themselves there. And of course, over time, the commoners would also wash themselves there. Now, temples like this would often have copper tubs, right? We spoke about tubs. Unfortunately, this is not a regular bathtub, but they would have these large copper tubs because these would allow them to heat up a lot of water all at once. And then you would go and you would get the water with another vessel, or you would use tubes or pipes in order to get the water where you wanted it to go. What's really funny about that, though, is that temples, when they were in conflict, would sometimes go to another temple, ravage it, and then steal their copper tub and then install it in their own temple. This happened in 1199. The Kofukuji monks stole from the Horyuji temple, where they went over and they took their tub and then brought it back home and installed it there. So this actually was a thing that happened, and I just think it's kind of hilarious that monks would break into each other's temples and steal copper tubs. There's just something, I don't know, funny or petty or something about it. Now, returning to the significance of especially the baths created by the Buddhist temples, was that Because all of the baths were basically managed by the Buddhists, the architectural style of Buddhism came to be associated with baths, and so even when lords and rich people would build their own baths at home, these would all be created in the style of Buddhist baths, or Buddhist architectural styles. And this could even be seen today, I believe, in Toyotomi Hideyoshi's personal bath. Now, even what would later come to be bath houses, until very recently, actually many of them had this particular style. Unfortunately, the skills needed to create it and maintain it have gradually been getting lost, and it's also very, very time intensive. So it takes a lot of time and it's very expensive to do this, and so modern bathhouses don't really do it anymore. Now though, we get to the really exciting part, because we're going to be talking about Yukatabira. That sounds familiar to something we know, doesn't it? The yukata. And yes, you would be right, the Yukatabira is indeed the yukata. But what did you use it for? So, in the earlier times, when you would go into a temple to bathe, you would be donning a Yukatabira. So people bathed in temples using these white robes. However, over time, that fell out of fashion, and so instead you would wear them after having bathed. And so in the bath, what you would wear were loincloths, these fundoshi as they were known, and women would use koshimakis, which were wraparounds at the waist. However, then in a period that I can't remember right now and we'll put here on the screen, you stopped using Yukatabira at all, except for very special ritualistic events. This was until the Edo period, at which point these yukata were brought back again, as yukata this time, as summer wear. So you removed the bira, and now they were just yukata, and they were used for warm weather. And so that's actually the history behind the yukata. Originally, a bathrobe used in temples. The more you know. And a fun side story here is that, used as a yukatabira, the shogun would actually not be dried using towels. So instead, what you would do when he came out of the tower, out of the bath, all wet, was they would put a yukatabira on him. And then that would soak up the water. And then they would put another one, and another one, until he was dry. And so the way of drying the shogun was just to continually put on yukatabira until he was dry eventually. Which I find that hilarious. As for the question of when did the temple baths change into public baths, at which specific time did this happen? Well, the thing is, it's actually uncertain. And so what is guessed or assumed is that it was around the 11th century. Now, many of the nobles as well used these public baths at the time. However, of course, they didn't want to get polluted by these dirty commoners. And so what they actually did was they would rent out the entire bathhouse just for themselves. So as long as they were using it, they would just pay and just take the entire building for themselves. Which, again, interesting. But when you consider the thoughts around, again, purity and defilement, it does sort of make sense, but it is still interesting that they would do it that way. With this proliferation of bathhouses separate from the temples, around 1401 or 1402 was when the word Sento came into use for the first time, which is the word we use today as well for bathhouses in Japan. Or many of them at least. There are several names for it, but that's one of the main words used. So a little side story. Around the end of the Ashikaga period and the beginning of the Momoyama period, there was a town called Sakai, within which there was a subpart of the town called Yuyamachi, which was known as Bath Town, which just showed that bath facilities were becoming more and more popular over the years. Until now, we have covered various topics. However, most of them have been relating to either the technology or the move towards public bathing, as well as the religious aspects. However, what we haven't covered is tubs. So the Japanese at this time used two types of tubs, and that's four. So let's do this. Two types of tubs, which were wooden tubs and metal tubs. Now, both were used, and especially around, again, this year, the metal tubs were the primarily used ones. And these looked a lot like cauldrons. So if you can think of the cartoons of your childhood where somebody would get caught by the savage natives or by a monster and get ready to be cooked in a big iron cauldron, it sort of looked like that. And so there were different variations or ways to do it, but you would either put fire directly underneath, or you would pour in hot water into the cauldron, and then people would bathe in it. So around 1202, when Todaiji Temple was rebuilt, they actually added one of these iron cauldrons. What is, however, very interesting as well is that masters would sometimes have their servants create warm water outside of the bathroom, and then they would have pipes leading into their tub, which the servants would then pour in the water so they could stay alone in the bathroom and have hot water coming to them. So there were various creative ways of going about it in the early period. As for the wooden tubs, however, these became popular after the metal tubs, but they had actually been used for longer, likely, than the metal tubs for a long time. And we know this because when you look at pictures as well as early accounts of noble life, these wooden tubs were mentioned, or they could be seen indirectly. And so we know they've been used for a long time, although they didn't gain popularity, broadly speaking, until much later. However, the technology to make the wooden tubs was already there back during the Heian period, and so it is likely that they were more numerous than was first assumed or has been generally assumed. Even so, it is important to note that as far as the bathtubs are concerned, this was not something that common Japanese people had access to. These were to be found in, for example, temples or the homes of rich people or nobles, etc. And so there was still a pretty big divide here, and only really, again, the rich and the powerful would have them. The majority of the commoners would bathe in these shared public baths, which were largely sponsored by and managed by the Buddhist temples all the way until the 16th and 17th century. And again, the baths were largely steam baths at the time. So earlier we talked about the iwaburo, the stone bath, as well as the oven bath, the kamaburo. Now there is another bath, the todanaburo, which was like the cabinet bath. And this was a bath that came a bit later, where you would have basically almost like a small shed or a cabin with a sliding door. So you could keep in the steam, and then underneath it, the planks in the floor would have holes beneath or between them. So you would heat up the water, boil it, and create steam that went into the cabinet. So these, as well as tubs, etc., were used in cities, as opposed to iwaburo and kamaburo, which were used other places. And so the todanaburo became very popular leading into the Edo period and also throughout the Edo period. However, if you want to learn more about all the things that happened with Japanese bathing culture in the Edo period, be sure to check out this video next, where we will explore exactly that. My God.